Okay, in this lecture, we're going to talk about the feedback section of Massive. So you'll notice down here next to your noise generator, you have a little feedback block, and it has an active and deactive selector, and it has an amplitude knob with 2 modulation slots below it, a fader here, in which you can select its output going to either filter 1 or 2 or any ratio thereof. And then you have some language to the left here, which is indicating the point at which the audio is being sent to the feedback section. So what is feedback exactly? Well, feedback allows you to take a portion of the audio signal at a certain point in the processing chain and reroute it back through everything. Okay, so it makes more sense if you look at the routing page. So let's go over here to our general pages, select the routing page, and let's look at this. So you have these 4 blocks that say FB on them. That's our feedback selector button. You have it after filter 2 here, after filter 1, in between the inserts in the amplitude section, and then after the amplitude but before the effects. So there are 4 places in which you can grab the signal and send it back to the beginning. So you can just see this when I click here on this feedback button. This blue line pops up and it moves around the outside here. It can go through one of the inserts if I choose to, back here to the feedback section. And then where does it go from there? Well, it can be spread between the 2 filters, or it can just choose one or the other of them. And then it goes back through the same thing and back to the feedback. So you can see how this creates a feedback loop. So if you've ever been around microphones and speakers, you know that feedback can be a bad thing that you don't want, but it can also be a good thing. For example, with playing electric guitar, you can create some really cool sounds using feedback between your guitar's pickup and the amplifier. The same is true with the synthesizer, where you can use feedback to your advantage, but it can also really muddy up the patch and even cause some damage to your speakers or your headphones. So be careful when playing around with feedback. But feedback can be used in a lot of different fun ways, and sort of the most typical purpose of feedback is to just provide some saturation and warmth to a sound. Massive has the tendency to sound a little bit digital and cold, if you want to call it that. You can use feedback to really emulate some of the circuitry in analog synthesizers and just give some of that warmth and saturation to your patches. So I'm going to open up a new patch here, and let's just look at some of the ways to enable feedback and make it do what we want it to do. So right now my feedback is located post A. That means post amp and pan. If it's selected here, then you'll see over here in my language it will say pre-A, so pre-amp and pan. If I have it post amp and pan, and I'm just playing a note, when I increase the amplitude knob of the feedback section, you'll start to hear it get warmer and then distort pretty quickly. So there you can hear a little bit of that saturation. And then up here in our meter, you can see that we're definitely peaking because we're creating a feedback loop that's distorting the output. Okay, so that's why I say you should be careful, because I'm just barely past halfway and I'm definitely peaking already. So some typical applications of this are to smooth out the resonant peak in a filter, or to add some drive to a sound, some distortion. And it's a lot of fun when you start using some modulation sources on here to vary this feedback over time. But let's just look at a couple ways to apply this. So I'm going to deselect these inserts. and I'm going to choose feedback 1 to occur after filter 1, like this. And then for filter 1, I'll set up a low-pass filter. I'll put the cutoff frequency right about 2 o'clock, and I'm going to turn up the resonance a little bit. So without the feedback, you can hear a little bit of that squelchiness from the resonance knob, like that. You can hear that resonant peak moving up and down the frequency spectrum. We can use feedback to smooth that out a little bit and just make it sound a little bit more squashed. So I'm going to turn up the amplitude, and I'm going to first send my fader to filter 1, because we just want to have a nice little loop there. And I'm also going to change my filter mix to just filter 1. And I'm going to make sure that my output of filter 1 is all the way up. So that's without the feedback. And you can just hear how that brought in some body, which is pretty cool. And just made the sound a little bit warmer. Okay, so that's one application of the feedback. Another thing you can do is you can use it to create some nice warm drive to your sounds. So let's look at an example of that now. I'm going to deactivate this low pass filter. I don't want any filters right now. And I'm going to choose a sine shaper for my insert number 1. I'm going to turn the drive up and the dry wet all the way up. The sine shaper will give you some distortion. This is the sound without that insert. And this is it with it. Now if I activate my feedback and just make sure the amplitude isn't too loud, now my signal's going through that insert and then into the feedback generator, and then it's going to return back here and keep going through that loop. So you can hear how much that changed the sound when I add this feedback to the to that sine-shaped sound. Now, remember that in your routing page, choosing the location of the insert or the feedback will drastically change the sound that you're producing. So let's look at some examples of that. This is what it sounds like with the insert occurring before the feedback. What happens if I put it over here? It's much less harsh, like that. You can also put the insert after the feedback section and in that feedback loop here. So that's way extreme, and I'm clipping over here. You can barely even hear any distinction between the notes. But see, you can have some fun moving this amplitude knob around to create some pretty wild distortion effects. So that's basically how feedback works, and we'll talk more about it when we're building our own sounds later on in the course. But just to recap, you can use feedback to grab the audio signal at a certain point in the processing chain, throw it back around to the beginning and have it start over there. And so that way you're creating this little feedback loop of your audio signal that's affecting itself and affecting itself and affecting itself in that way. And to do so, you just select wherever you want it or here in the routing page. And then you tell your feedback generator how much amplitude to output, and then to which filter should it go. Filter 1, filter 2, some ratio of the two in between. All right, so that's feedback. See you in the next lecture.